My hands were shaking as I watched her turn the key in my front door like she owned the place. The faint click of the deadbolt sliding open felt louder than any gunshot I'd ever heard. I was standing just out of sight, close enough to hear the brass scrape against the lock, close enough to smell the faint chemical scent of the sanitizer she always carried. For months, this woman, Kimberly Hall, our self-proclaimed HOA president, had been making our lives hell. Nasty letters. Fines for imaginary violations. Threats slipped into our mailbox at midnight. And now here she was, stepping into my home like she had every right in the world. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of dull gray day when even the birds go quiet. The gate had creaked when she came through. I'd meant to oil it, but maybe it was better that way. It gave me warning. I pressed my back to the hallway wall and listened to the sound of her heels tapping against my hardwood floor. Slow, confident, she wasn't here to look around. She was here because she thought she'd already won. You ever have that moment when a bully pushes just far enough that something inside you stops being afraid? That was me right then. My fear shifted into something else, a cold, steady burn. Kimberly thought she could break me with paperwork and intimidation. She thought she could use her HOA badge like a crown. What she didn't know was that her little game was about to collide with the one person she never should have crossed. I kept perfectly still as she pulled out her phone. Her voice was sharp, clipped, rehearsed. Yes, dispatch, I'm inside the property now. The homeowner is uncooperative, dangerous. You need to send units immediately. Her tone had that fake quiver like she was reading lines in a play. I almost laughed. She really thought she was orchestrating the grand finale, painting herself as the savior of the neighborhood about to have me hauled off in cuffs. I wished I'd been filming her face when the knock came at the door. It was strong, confident, not the hesitant rap of a neighbor, not the soft courtesy tap of a delivery guy. This was a law enforcement knock, the kind that makes your stomach drop if you're not expecting it. Kimberly straightened her jacket, smoothed her hair, and gave me this little smirk as if to say, checkmate. She swung open the door with the arrogance of someone about to collect a trophy, but the moment her eyes landed on the person standing outside, the blood drained from her face. I'll never forget it. Because it wasn't just the police, it was my wife. Rachel stood there in full uniform, badge catching the dim light, her sidearm holstered but impossible to miss. 20 years on the force, the last 12 as a detective, and just recently promoted to chief of police. The weight of her presence filled the doorway before she even spoke. Is there a problem here? Rachel's voice was calm, controlled, but it carried that edge only seasoned officers have, the kind that makes liars fold. Kimberly froze, her mouth opened but no words came out. For 20 years, she'd built her empire of intimidation on arrogance and gossip, on the assumption that no one would ever challenge her authority. And in that single instant, the whole tower she'd built started to crumble. I stepped forward then, finally letting her see me. Funny thing about calling the cops on someone, I said quietly. Sometimes the cop is married to the man you're trying to destroy. The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice, then fell quiet as if even it knew something big had just shifted. Have you ever witnessed that rare, perfect moment when a bully finally tastes the medicine they've been dishing out for years? That flicker in their eyes when they realize they've lost? That's what I saw on Kimberly's face. 20 years of smug arrogance collapsing into pure, unfiltered fear. And let me tell you, it was the sweetest justice I'd ever felt. But even in that moment of triumph, a question pressed hard at the back of my mind, a question I wasn't ready to face yet. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about nosy HOA politics anymore. The way Kimberly had gotten into my house, the way she had detailed knowledge of things she shouldn't, it meant something bigger was at play, something darker. And that knock at the door, it wasn't the end, it was only the beginnings. The morning after Kimberly's stunt, I woke up before dawn, couldn't sleep. The house was too still, even the fridge hum seemed louder than usual, like the silence itself was warning me. I walked out back in my boots, the soles crunching against damp soil, and found myself standing in front of my father's memorial garden. Roses and lilies, some drooping from last night's dew, surrounded the simple stone marker I'd placed 28 years ago. It wasn't much, just a corner of the yard. But it was his wish, the only thing he asked me to protect before he died. I brushed some dirt off the marker and just stood there remembering him. Colonel James Bryant, Vietnam, 1st Cavalry. He never talked much about the war, but when he did, it was always about the garden. Grow something good, he'd told me once. That's how you beat the ugliness. But that morning, something new caught my eye. A ring of challenge coins placed with military precision around the plants. Too perfect, too deliberate, my stomach sank. These weren't gifts from some grateful neighbor, they were markers, a message. The back of my neck prickled. I went straight inside, pulled up the security camera feed I'd installed a few weeks back after some kids had been messing around in the neighborhood. The footage from 2 a.m. played grainy on my laptop, and I wished I hadn't pressed play. A figure moving across my backyard like a ghost, not stumbling like a drunk teenager, not casual like a neighbor cutting through. This was controlled, deliberate. The way they hugged the fence line, the way they kept their head angled to avoid the camera, it was training, military training. I replayed it 3 times, hood up, no clear face, precise movements. Each coin placed like part of a ritual. By the 3rd run, my hands were trembling so hard I had to grip the desk to steady them. Who the hell does that in a suburban backyard at 2 in the morning? And how did they know enough about my father's service to leave those specific coins? That's when Kimberly Hall made her grand entrance. I heard the sharp click of her heels before I saw her, striding across my lawn like she was leading a parade. Perfectly pressed suit, hair so neat it looked like it belonged in a catalog, clutching a stack of papers like a weapon. "Mr. Bryant," she announced, voice ringing out in that fake official tone she always used, "I have here an emergency health violation order regarding an unauthorized memorial structure in your backyard." She held up the papers as though they were holy scripture, but it wasn't the legal threat that froze me, it was what she said next. "I understand your father served with the 1st Cavalry in Vietnam, specifically at Firebase Charlie, 1968. My coffee mug nearly slipped from my hand. Firebase Charlie, that wasn't in public records, that wasn't even supposed to exist. My father had told me fragments whispered late at night after nightmares. A mission gone wrong, lives lost, classified, sealed so deep not even military archives would hand over the files when I'd tried. How does an HOA president know about Firebase Charlie? She kept talking about soil contamination and public safety violations, but her words blurred into nothing. My mind was racing. Classified missions, government databases, someone feeding her information they had no business knowing. And then she smiled that smile, the kind that says I know something you don't. "You have 30 days to remove the structure or face $15,000 in fines," she said smoothly. And then with a pause that made my skin crawl, "Perhaps, if you're willing to discuss what other family heirlooms might be stored in your basement, we could find a more flexible solution." My basement, where my father's Purple Heart collection sat locked inside a safe only Rachel and I knew about, worth more than 80 grand but priceless to me. She wasn't just threatening the garden, she was fishing, hunting, and the fact that she even knew about that safe told me this wasn't about HOA dues or neighborhood rules. Someone somewhere was watching us. That night I sat at my computer trying to pull up the old cemetery permit my father had filed back in '85. The county had digitized everything, so it should have been simple. A few clicks, a slow load, and there it was, the original filing. My heart slowed for a moment, proof. Then right in front of my eyes, the screen went black, not sleep mode, not a power outage, just black. When it came back, the document was gone, erased from the system, but the timestamp was still there. It had been deleted 30 seconds earlier, at the exact moment I was reading it. Someone wasn't just watching, they were monitoring my keystrokes in real time. I sat there staring at the blank screen, hands shaking again. This wasn't some HOA power trip anymore. This was bigger, deeper. Kimberly Hall wasn't just after my father's garden. She was part of something that reached into government systems, something that knew my family's secrets better than I did. And in that moment, I realized the nightmare was only just beginning. The phone rang just after dawn, sharp enough to cut through the silence of the house. I'd barely slept. Rachel stirred beside me but didn't reach for it. The call was for me. I answered, voice rough. "Patrick," a whisper came through, trembling. "I can't talk on the phone. Coffee shop on 5th, 1 hour, bring nothing electronic." Click. It was Janet Martinez, the HOA secretary. 8 years she'd worked under Kimberly, handling everything from landscaping disputes to foreclosures. I'd never once heard fear in her voice. Until now. An hour later, I was sitting in a corner booth, steam rising from a chipped mug of diner coffee. Janet was already there, clutching a manila folder like it was nuclear launch codes. Her hands shook as she pushed it across the table. "I copied these before I lost my nerve," she whispered. I opened the folder and the world tilted sideways. Floor plans of my house, basement dimensions marked in red, telephoto lens shots of my backyard from angles I didn't even know were possible, a dossier on my father's military service more detailed than anything I'd ever seen, dates, units, even names of men who died beside him, things only he had ever told me. But it was the financial records that hit hardest. Line items marked consulting fees, $15,000 of our HOA dues paid to something called Heritage Military Appraisals, shipping invoices to Nevada and Arizona, package weights that matched military medals down to the ounce. Someone was running a theft ring right out of our neighborhood using our HOA as cover. There's more, Janet whispered, eyes darting toward the window like she expected someone to burst in any second. Tom Wilson, he said some appraiser contacted him, offered $8,000 for his father's Bronze Star collection. The man knew details Tom never told anyone, exact battle date, names of other soldiers. I drove straight to Tom's house. The old man answered in a flannel shirt, smelling of wood smoke and black coffee. His eyes darkened when I told him what Janet had said. He offered me way more than they're worth, Tom admitted. I turned him down, something didn't feel right, but I wonder how many families said yes when they needed money for bills. The words stuck in my chest. How many widows had been tricked into selling their husbands' medals for pennies? How many veterans' children had given up priceless heirlooms just to pay tuition? That night back at my desk, I flipped through Janet's stolen records again. Shipping manifests showed packages leaving our zip code every few weeks. The weights lined up perfectly: Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, campaign medals. The return addresses were post office boxes, but the tracking numbers led straight to auction houses. Someone had built a pipeline. They weren't just stealing military artifacts. They were laundering them through interstate auctions, selling them to collectors nationwide, and they were funding it with our HOA dues. Then I found the page that made my blood run cold. A shipping receipt dated yesterday. Origin, Tom Wilson's address. Destination, Heritage Collectibles, Las Vegas. Weight, 8 ounces. Exactly the weight of 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. I called Tom immediately. Did you change your mind? Did you sell them? What, hell no, he said. They're in my safe right now. I read him the shipping details, silence on the other end, then finally his voice flat and scared. Patrick, that's my signature on the receipt, but I never signed anything. The air left the room. Identity theft, forgery. They weren't just stealing medals, they were forging paperwork and shipping stolen goods under veterans' own names, using their reputations as cover. I imagine the network behind it: database access to get personal information, surveillance to catalog collections, skilled forgers to fake signatures, shipping networks to move stolen goods across state lines. This wasn't neighborhood crime, this was organized crime. That evening, I knocked on the Hendersons' door, then the Kowalskis, then the Pattersons. Each story was the same: medals gone, paperwork forged, signatures faked, families left with nothing but shame and suspicion. Every family had something in common: financial struggles, hospital bills, college tuition, job loss. They'd been profiled, studied, targeted when they were weakest. And that's when it hit me. Kimberly Hall wasn't just some power-drunk HOA president. She was the tip of a spear, a criminal operation that had been running for months, maybe years, hiding in plain sight. And my family was next. Rachel's phone buzzed at 5 in the morning, shattering what little rest we'd managed. She sat up in bed, hair a mess, eyes narrowing at the caller ID. Detective Mark Webb. She worked cases with him for years. If he was calling before sunrise, it wasn't good. Her face went pale as she listened. No interruptions, no questions, just that cop stillness she'd perfected over 20 years on the job. Then she hung up and swung her legs out of bed. Patrick, she said, voice low, the police database has been breached. Someone been pulling records for weeks. She was already pulling on her uniform, the crisp navy fabric catching the first gray light leaking through our blinds. I sat there numb while she explained. Hundreds of queries, names of Purple Heart recipients, Bronze Star winners, families of the fallen, even PTSD treatment records. Someone had been building a target list using the same system Rachel was sworn to protect. Within 20 minutes, Detective Webb was at our kitchen table, spreading papers like a war map, printouts of system logs, timestamps, and query lists. Whoever did this knew exactly what to look for, he said, and how to cover their tracks. I scanned the documents, my coffee going cold in my hand. It was all there: addresses, family sizes, even psychological evaluations. Everything a criminal would need to profile veteran families. Everything Kimberly had hinted she already knew. This isn't random theft, Webb said. This is coordinated. Someone inside law enforcement or with access to our systems has been feeding intel directly to your HOA president. The weight of it pressed on me. Rachel's job wasn't just compromised. Our marriage, our safety, our future, all of it was now a weapon in someone else's hands. Then Webb pulled out another sheet, this one with company names, development firms, auction houses. On the surface, they looked clean, but their ownership chains led back to the same corporate structure spread across multiple states. "These aren't just businesses," he said grimly. "They're laundering fronts. Military artifacts go in one end, come out the other with paperwork that looks airtight. By the time they're sold in Florida or Japan or God knows where, they're clean." The words should have been reassuring. Federal crimes meant federal attention, but all I felt was dread, because if they were this careful, this methodical, they wouldn't hesitate to erase anyone who got too close. The evidence of that came just hours later. At 3 in the afternoon, Rachel's department issued phone buzzed with an encrypted message. No name, just a number routed through the police network. She opened it and I watched the blood drain from her face. "Your husband took something that doesn't belong to him. Check your basement safe. We know the combination is your wedding date. You have 24 hours to return our property or join him in federal prison." My skin went ice cold. They knew about the safe, the metals, even the combination, a detail so personal we'd only ever joked about it once on our anniversary. Rachel locked eyes with me. "This came from inside the station," she whispered. "Someone in my department sent this." That broke her, not visibly, not in front of me, but I saw it in the way she clenched her jaw, the way her hand trembled as she slid the phone across the table. 20 years of building trust in her badge, her team, her duty, and now, the rot was sitting in the next office, working the next shift. I walked downstairs into the cool air of the basement and stood in front of the safe. The numbers on the dial blurred as I thought about all the times I'd spun them casually, never thinking anyone was watching. But someone had been for months, maybe years. How many times had they studied us? How many little details, the way Rachel brushed her hair back when she was stressed, the way I carried coffee into the garden at dawn, had they logged into some twisted file? I put my hand against the steel door and realized this wasn't about money. This was about control, about showing us they could reach into the most private corners of our lives and twist them into weapons. Upstairs, Webb's voice cut through my thoughts. "Patrick, this isn't just corruption, this is infiltration. These people have been inside your systems for years, and if they know about Firebase Charlie, if they know about your father, then this isn't about metals anymore, it's about secrets. Secrets my father had carried to his grave, secrets that, apparently, someone was still willing to kill for." That night, as the crickets chirped outside and the house settled into uneasy silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow held eyes. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder we weren't just being watched, we were being hunted. And tomorrow, the hunt was going to get worse. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock, but I got there an hour early. Habit maybe, or maybe I just needed time to steady myself. The community center smelled faintly of floor polish and burnt coffee, the kind they make in giant metal urns that have seen better decades. I laid out my notes like I was preparing for a military briefing, charts, financial records, shipping manifests, photographs. 3 weeks of digging, sleepless nights, whispered meetings with Janet. It was all there, proof that Kimberly wasn't just a tyrant with a clipboard. She was the face of a criminal network. By the time the clock hit 7, the room was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen at a meeting. Neighbors shifting in their folding chairs, murmurs echoing off the cheap tile walls. I scanned the crowd and the seating arrangement told me everything. Kimberly's supporters sat proudly in the front rows, nodding like soldiers at parade rest. The veteran families, the ones who'd been targeted, lingered in the back, scattered and isolated, avoiding eye contact. Kimberly walked in last, flanked by 2 men in suits. Her smile was bright, practiced. The kind of smile meant to sell you something you don't need. She took her seat at the front like it was a throne, and the murmurs grew into silence. I stood, my papers felt heavier than they should have. "Fellow residents," I began, voice steady, "I have documentation proving that our HOA has been infiltrated by criminals who are systematically robbing veteran families. This isn't gossip, this isn't paranoia, this is evidence." The first murmur rolled through the room, but it wasn't shock, it was disbelief, shaking heads, whispered scoffs. I pressed on, holding up the first document. Financial records showing $15,000 in HOA dues paid to shell companies. Shipping manifests proving stolen military metals were moved across state lines, photographs of our homes under surveillance. Before I could continue, one of Kimberly's suited companions rose. Sharp tie, slick hair, voice like ice. "Mr. Bryant," he said smoothly, "that information was obtained through unauthorized access to confidential HOA files. Displaying it here constitutes criminal activity. None of it would be admissible in any legal proceeding." Gasps, murmurs. I looked to Janet for support, but she sat stiff as stone, eyes down. When they called her forward, my stomach dropped. Under oath, Janet admitted she'd given me the documents. She tried to explain, to say she'd only done it because she feared for the community, but the words twisted in the lawyer's mouth turned into betrayal. The very evidence we needed was now poisoned, dismissed as stolen property. I watched my case collapse in real time. Kimberly's smile widened with every passing second. "This is exactly the kind of dangerous behavior we've been dealing with," she declared, standing tall, projecting her voice like she was delivering a campaign speech. "Mr. Bryant has been breaking into offices, harassing neighbors, intimidating witnesses. This is not how civilized people resolve disputes. This is the behavior of someone unstable, someone dangerous." The crowd nodded, they believed her. By the time I tried to respond, the narrative had already been written. I wasn't a concerned veteran protecting his family. I was a paranoid man waving stolen documents around, trying to stir chaos in a peaceful neighborhood. That night, the local news twisted the knife deeper. Footage of me at the meeting, red-faced, holding papers aloft. Kimberly, calm and composed, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The headline, "Disturbed Veteran Attacks HOA President." I sat on the couch with the TV flickering blue across my face, fists clenched, Rachel silent beside me. The interview they aired made bile rise in my throat. "I feel threatened by his militant behavior," Kimberly said, voice breaking just enough to sound real. "Veterans deserve our respect, but when someone uses military training to intimidate civilians, we have to protect our community." She turned the tables perfectly. I was no longer a victim, I was the villain. But just when it felt like the walls were closing in, Salvation walked through our front door the next morning. Her name was Agent Victoria Hayes, FBI, sharp suit, sharper eyes, carrying a briefcase that promised this wasn't a courtesy visit. She sat at our kitchen table, spread out photographs and files, and in a calm voice that cut through all the noise, said the words I'd been desperate to hear. "Mr. Bryant, you're not crazy. What you've uncovered matches a pattern we've been tracking across multiple states. This isn't neighborhood politics, this is organized crime." For the first time in weeks, I felt something I thought I'd lost. Hope. Agent Victoria Hayes had the kind of calm presence that instantly shifted the energy in the room. She didn't posture, didn't raise her voice. She just opened her briefcase, laid out photographs, and let the evidence speak for itself. "Your neighborhood," she said, tapping the table, "isn't the first. We've tracked nearly identical operations in 12 states. Always the same pattern, a charismatic HOA president, a sudden crackdown on violations, and then veterans' families start losing their military collections." I leaned closer. The photos she spread out showed boxes on loading docks, medals displayed in auction catalogs, even grainy surveillance of people I didn't recognize carrying crates into storage facilities. Each image carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "These people aren't just greedy," Hayes continued. "They're strategic. They infiltrate communities, build trust, and then quietly strip families of their heritage. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the artifacts are in foreign markets, Japan, Germany, Australia, places where American military history fetches premium prices." The words rattled around in my skull, my father's medals, Tom Wilson's bronze stars, the Hendersons' heirlooms, all of it just inventory in someone's ledger. Rachel folded her arms, her badge catching the light. "So Kimberly's just a pawn." Hayes shook her head. "She's more than that, she's a node. Recruiters look for vulnerable people, widows, spouses with financial pressure, people with grudges. Kimberly lost her husband and was easy to manipulate. They gave her power, status, and just enough information to make her dangerous. She thinks she's in control, but really she's being used." For a moment, the silence in our kitchen was broken only by the hum of the fridge and the scratch of my pen on Hayes's notes. I couldn't stop writing. I needed every detail, every thread. Then Hayes said something that froze me. "We've also confirmed what Detective Webb suspected. Your police systems have been compromised. Someone inside your department has been feeding intel, not just names and addresses, but financial records, even PTSD evaluations. That's how they knew who to target, when to strike." Rachel stiffened, her own department, her own team, corrupted. Hayes's eyes softened just enough to register empathy. "Chief, I know what this means for you, but you need to understand these people don't play by neighborhood rules. They're organized, resourced, and ruthless. The more you push back, the more dangerous they'll become." That warning proved true within hours. I'd stepped outside that afternoon, the autumn air crisp and heavy with the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down the block. My mind was still turning over every word Hayes had said. I reached my car, and that's when I saw it tucked under my windshield wiper. A medal, a Purple Heart. The The sun had warmed the metal, and when I picked it up, the engraving caught the light. For Valor, Colonel James Bryant, Vietnam 1968. My knees nearly gave out. This was my father's missing medal. The one we'd assumed was lost in the chaos after his death, maybe misplaced by the funeral home, but here it was, returned like a calling card. I carried it inside, hands trembling, and set it on the table in front of Rachel and Hayes. Neither spoke right away. Hayes examined it, her face tightening. "This changes everything," she said finally. "Someone been holding this for almost 3 decades. They waited until now to return it. That means their connection to your father goes much deeper than we realized. This isn't random theft, Patrick. You've been targeted because of who he was and what he knew." I stared at the metal, its weight pulling me backward in time. My father's garden, his nightmares, the whispered word he'd muttered once in a half-sleep, Charlie, Firebase Charlie. The metal wasn't just a relic, it was a message. That night, as I lay awake listening to the faint groan of the house settling, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about my yard or fines or even medals anymore. It was about secrets buried decades ago, secrets my father had carried to his grave, secrets that Kimberly and the people behind her were willing to destroy entire families to keep hidden. And if they'd waited 28 years to send me this message, it meant they had a plan that stretched across generations. Tomorrow, I would find out just how far they were willing to go. The morning of the sting was brittle and bright, the kind of clear autumn day that makes every shadow look sharper. Agent Hayes briefed us in whispers around a folding table beneath a tarp of surveillance equipment, the hum of generators like a low timbre in the background. Federal vans idled down the block, their engines a comforting muted growl. Rachel checked her uniform twice, not for show, but because she moves like ritual, the way a cop prepares before a storm. I remember the taste of coffee and the hollow of my stomach. Everything felt magnified, like the moment before a race gun fires. They'd set the trap with surgical patience. Months of intercepted emails, pinned surveillance warrants, and surveillance teams embedded in unmarked cars. Hayes had built a paper trail so clean that it could survive any legal needlepoint. What she hadn't counted on was how brazen Kimberly had become. Desperation makes people sloppy. She'd been making mistakes, late-night phone calls from unsecured lines, predictable routes to storage facilities, a complacency that only grows when you think you're untouchable. At 9:30, she walked up my porch like a woman with a plan and no fear left to lose. I watched her from behind the bay window, the glass giving everything a slight shimmer, the world filtered through a retina. She carried a leather satchel and a look I'd seen before, the tired determination of someone convinced the end justifies the means. Her fingers worked over the lock with practiced ease. 2 minutes in, she had the basement door open. Hayes's hand brushed my shoulder and the room around us snapped to surgical focus. She moved through the house like she'd been inside a dozen times before, just as the thermal cameras showed on the feed. Straight to the basement, past the living room where childhood pictures watched, past the kitchen with the knife block and dented toaster. Federal teams padded quietly behind, infrared goggles painting everything in eerie green. Kimberly didn't know we were watching. She didn't know the basement had been turned into a stage. Evidence files neatly arrayed, digital recorders blinking, agents in plain clothes pretending to be boxes and dust. Her bag hit the concrete floor like a declaration. She started rifling through the false safe we'd set up, the one filled with decoys, authentication paperwork, and planted evidence that would unravel her story. She was already whispering into her phone when the front door popped and Rachel stepped into the stairwell, badge catching the meager light, uniform crisp, authority wrapped tight in the set of her jaw. For a beat, Kimberly's face held the shape of someone who couldn't process betrayal. She'd expected empty rooms and fear, not a line of lawmen and women waiting to close. "Federal agents," Hayes announced softly and then louder, professional and cold. "Miss Hall, you are under arrest for conspiracy, trafficking in stolen property, wire fraud, and multiple counts of identity theft." Her hands moved before her brain did. She reached for a paper, a pen, a phone, anything to salvage control. An agent's hand closed on her wrist. There were cuffs. The clink sounded like final chapters closing. Kimberly went from queen to villain in 30 heartbeats. The recording equipment caught every second, the fumble, the angry mutter, the slip of a smile that turned into a snarl. Neighbors gathered at windows, a buzz of disbelief. A slow, delicious disbelief that made my lungs fill with a gratitude so sharp I had to breathe through it. And then, right as Hayes began reading the rights and the camera lenses ate the words, Kimberly locked eyes with me. For an instant, the criminal ease she'd worn for months fell away and something older and harder settled in her face, a flash of calculation, the kind that's born from years of doing what must be done to survive. Her voice was low, dangerous, and oddly intimate. You still don't know who your father really was, do you? She said. The words hit like a thrown thing. Ask Bill Thompson about the night he died. November 15th, 1995, that wasn't a heart attack. Agent Hayes stopped mid-sentence. The room went cold. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the oaks outside and someone somewhere clearing a throat. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. The date, precise, accusatory, landed with the weight of a verdict. It was information that should have been sealed away in classified files, not spat out by a garden-variety HOA criminal. Whoever had fed Kimberly that detail had to have access beyond municipal ledgers. Military knowledge. Intelligence. Hayes' hand went to her radio, voice clipped. Hold her. Evidence. This includes potential national security implications. Secure all communications. Papers that had been folded into neat bundles were suddenly thrust into deeper scrutiny. Richardson, the federal prosecutor, leaned in, eyes narrowed. Someone pulled a sealed envelope from a jacket, and there it was, a notation flag percolating up the chain. Kimberly's eyes were still on me when the cuffs tightened. For a moment, I understood why she'd been willing to gamble everything. Someone had told her secrets that made her the size of the world in her own mind. And in that same moment, I understood how dangerous the truth could be. If my father's death was no accident, if it was tied to Firebase Charlie and men who'd spent a lifetime covering tracks, then our little victory was only the opening salvo. They led her out past the eyes of the neighborhood, past the faces that had cheered her on 1,000 times, past the gardeners and retirees and kids on bikes who'd believed her story. Cameras followed the tow truck of justice as if the whole town were watching a play. But beneath the civic drama, something cold and old had been stirred awake. Kimberly's whisper, that precise date, that fatal claim, echoed in my head as the doors shut and the van pulled away. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a breadcrumb pointing to a graveyard of secrets. I felt the ground of my life shift. The memorial garden in the backyard, the coins, the deleted county files, they were pieces of a map I hadn't wanted to follow. And yet, as the federal teams packed up and Hayes promised me the truth would follow, I realized the worst part. Uncovering the truth might finally put a name to the face that had taken my father from me. It might mean the difference between justice and something far darker. Tomorrow we'd find Bill Thompson, and with him, perhaps, the reason someone had waited 28 years to make a move. The memory clinic smelled like antiseptic and cinnamon, a trade-off the staff used to mask the clinical cold. I'd rehearsed what I would say to Bill Thompson 1,000 times, and none of it felt right when I finally saw him. He sat in a wheelchair by a window, sunlight cutting the dust motes into gold. His hands were knotted with age, but when he smiled and placed a gnarled finger over his heart, it was the muscle memory of a man who'd learned rituals in foxholes and never forgot them. Patrick, he said, and the name landed like a warm hand on my shoulder. His voice was thin, threaded with fog, but the eyes, those eyes still held November of 1968. They sharpened when I mentioned Firebase Charlie, like muscle memory snapping into place. He didn't need prodding. He'd been coming to the garden for 28 years, a pilgrim who'd kept a secret in the bones of his body. We walked slowly among the clipped hedges outside the clinic while he told me what his memory would allow. Not tidy reports or clean testimony, fragments, shadows of the truth, the kind that carries the shape of something monstrous even when it's incomplete. He remembered a convoy at night, men who laughed too loud to be innocent, a ledger with names passed hand to hand. The phrase he kept returning to over and over like a stuck gear was supply diversion. Weapons, parts, shipments that never made it home, men who turned their training into a trade. You and your father, Bill said, fingers worrying a loose thread on his sleeve. You were both in the way, you kept poking at rusted hinges. Some doors are padlocked with teeth people will bite to keep closed. He stopped as if the memory had burned him, and then with the clarity of a man who'd practiced 100 benedictions, he reached into his jacket. For a second, I thought it might be one of the folded flags they hand out when someone dies. Instead, he produced a small, worn envelope. Inside was a yellowing note and a name scrawled in a hand I recognized instantly, not mine, not my father's. A name from a list I'd half hoped never to find again. My boy left this with me, Bill muttered. Told me if anything happened, don't let it go. His finger tapped the paper like it was a pulse. He wanted you to have this when the time came. The name on the note matched a ledger the FBI had already flagged, but had lacked the human thread to tie to the decades-old mystery. Agent Hayes called it a needle in a stack of needles. To me, it was a face on a photograph. Within days, the FBI had a warrant and the Department of Defense had opened cold files that had been locked away in classified vaults for years. The paper trail led to men who had been overlooked, reassigned, quietly retired, the seams where a state cover-up had been stitched. The investigations moved like a rigged clock finally reset. Names surfaced. Old affidavits were re-examined. Men who'd thought themselves safe in the complacency of age woke to subpoenas. The network that had stolen metals and then sold them overseas began to splinter as bank accounts were frozen and shipping manifests traced to shell corporations. Federal indictments followed: racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Kimberly's arrest was only the first of many doors that needed opening. There were moments that felt like homecoming and moments that felt like loss. We rebuilt the memorial garden with hands that knew how to mend hard things, my hands included. The stone that had been smashed was reset, the roses replanted. People who had turned away at the meeting now showed up with shovels and apologies. Linda Carter, who'd helped in ignorance, became the park steward. Janet received commendations and a quiet thanks from families she'd helped expose the truth. Rachel, who had carried a nation's betrayal and still found the strength to fight, was promoted into a federal position coordinating protection for military families. The legal reforms we fought for became law. The Patrick Bryant Protection Act tightened oversight of community associations and mandated background checks for leadership in areas with significant veteran populations. At the first annual ceremony in the park, recovery boxes of medals gleamed under tents. Children ran between display cases as if between islands of meaning. Bill Thompson wheeled himself to the front, hands steady for once, and placed flags on a rack of recovered Purple Hearts. He still got distracted, a name would start him remembering, then he'd trail off into silence. But when the crowd watched him, something in the room unclenched. We won some battles, but the ache of what we'd learned never fully left. Sitting on the bench by my father's stone, I found myself tracing the letters carved there and feeling the old, complicated pride. We had exposed a machine that had been hungry for years. We'd returned pieces of history to families who thought they'd lost them forever. Yet the map Kimberly had sketched with her arrogance had broader lines than any of us had guessed. The last thing she whispered before the cuffs closed, that date, that accusation, had been a breadcrumb, yes, but also a signal flare for men who'd spent a lifetime making sure no one followed. That winter, as the park settled into a hush between seasons, my phone rang. The caller ID said Pentagon Historical Division. Colonel Sarah Mitchell's voice was calm and direct. "Mr. Bryant," she said, "we need to talk about your father's final mission. New intelligence suggests this may be part of an operation far larger than the trafficking ring. We believe some elements are active even now. We could use someone who understands both the history and the harm." I let the late afternoon light fall across my palm and thought about the medals in display cases, the neighbors who learned how to protect each other, and the face of a man in cuffs who had thought she could trade in other people's grief. I thought about my father, about the promise he'd left me to grow something good out of ugliness. "Okay," I said, and my voice surprised me with how steady it was. "Tell me when." It wasn't the ending I'd wanted as a boy who buried toy soldiers in the garden. It wasn't neat. It was work, the kind of work that asks you to keep showing up even when the danger sneaks back in the night. But as I looked at the rows of flags and the children weaving between them, I felt the truth settle into a quiet place. Some battles close, others open into new ones. The metal in my hand had returned more than metal, it had returned a purpose. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.